What's up, guys? This is Kephas.
Welcome to SBA Spotlight. In these videos, I'll be covering how well the single button assistant performs for each spec, what it does well, where it falls short, and how to get the most out of it, especially if you're looking for a lower stress or more accessible way to play. So whether you're here to relax, overcome a limitation, or just see how far one button can take you, I've got you covered. Alright, so let's talk about the single button assistant and how it's working out for Shadow Priests. Honestly, the single button assistant can do really well with Shadow Priests, but it's kind of inconsistent. I always like to cite the Wowhead data for reference, and it's estimating about an 18% loss to your optimal DPS on a target dummy. So that's roughly 80% of optimal, and that's honestly not too bad. On paper, it follows a relatively optimal rotation pretty well. And when you look at everything the single button assistant will manage for you, it's actually an incredibly long list. For starters, it'll put you in shadow form if you're not already, which is always nice. It'll maintain your dots. It'll keep most of your core rotation abilities on cooldown, even some of your longer cooldown abilities like Halo, Shadow Fiend, Void Torrent. And if you've taken the Void Volley talent, where using Void Torrent will also transform it into Void Volley, the single button assistant will also use that. Of course, it will also manage spending your insanity on Devouring Plague, and it will also use Shadow Crash to apply your dots to multiple enemies. This is one of the major problems when it comes to the single button assistant in Shadow Priest though, is it's really good at using Shadow Crash whenever multiple enemies are nearby, almost too good, because it doesn't really care if you're at the beginning of a fight or you're at the end of a fight. If Shadow Crash is available and there are multiple enemies around, it's going to use it. So there will be times where it uses it really well. Right at the beginning of a fight, when the tank just pulled really big, there's a lot of enemies around, and bam, it throws out Shadow Crash. But then it can also use it at the end of a fight, leaving you without Shadow Crash for the next big pull. And this is really going to impact your AoE damage. There are going to be times where you do a ton of damage because you're able to just use Shadow Crash, and then there's going to be times where you're not doing as much damage because you're having to tab target around, applying your dots to as many targets as you can. And it's just one of the realities of using the single button assistant. It's trying to cover as much ground for you as it can, but it doesn't always have the nuance in handling all the abilities perfectly well. This is one of those times where I actually think an ability should probably be removed from the single button assistant, and obviously I'm referring to Shadow Crash, because so much of your AoE potency is tied to using Shadow Crash at the right times to get your dots out there, and that's going to allow you to do so much more AoE damage. Aside from that one issue though, it does handle most of your abilities pretty well. Now, there are a couple of abilities that the single button assistant doesn't use, namely your offensive cooldowns. This would include Void Eruption, Dark Ascension, and Power Infusion. This is actually important to bring up because if you've chosen Void Eruption as a talent, then you might notice that it's included in the tooltip for your single button assistant. But it's misleading because the single button assistant doesn't use Void Eruption. The reason why it's doing this is because when you use Void Eruption, that spell will transform into Void Bolt, and the single button assistant will use Void Bolt. Which means that you will have to use Void Eruption on a separate button, but once you do, you can continue using the single button assistant and it will manage Void Bolt for you. So by default, Void Eruption and Dark Ascension will have to be managed on separate buttons. However, you do have a little bit more wiggle room with Power Infusion because it is off the global cooldown, which means that you have the option to macro it in with a single button assistant using a simple in-game macro. I've gone ahead and created this macro, and you can find it in the description if you want to copy and paste it into the game. Simply put it in a macro, slide it on your action bar, and you'll be good to go. It'll use the single button assistant, and it will also use Power Infusion whenever it's available. It'll also use any unused trinkets that you have, and I haven't included them, but if you have any racials that you'd like to use, those are also off the global cooldown. So you're free to add those in yourself if you want to. Now, as I said concerning your main offensive cooldown abilities, Void Eruption and Dark Ascension, the most straightforward and arguably best way to manage them is simply using them on separate buttons whenever they're available. But if you really want to consolidate them in a one button with the single button assistant, then there's always GSE. This is an add-on that allows you to create advanced macros, and again, I've gone ahead and created one of these as well. You can find it in the description. Simply import it into GSE in-game, and it will cycle between the single button assistant and your offensive cooldown of choice. Of course, just like with Shadow Crash, these types of macros aren't always going to be optimal. They're simply going to use the abilities whenever they're available, regardless of what's going on in the fight. But if you're looking for extra simplification, then that option is there for you. Overall, aside from Shadow Crash, the single button assistant does relatively well for Shadow Priests. Like with most classes, it doesn't use your main offensive cooldowns, but those are pretty easy to use even without GSE. Despite a few hiccups, especially in AoE situations, the single button assistant does pretty well, and you should be able to do a lot of content with it. And that's pretty much everything I've learned for now. But as always, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think of the single button assistant and how is it working out for you so far? Let me know in the comments. But with all that being said, I will see you guys on the next one.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. And if you'd like to see more videos, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook, and if you'd like, you can support my work on Patreon. Links to all that stuff can be found in the description below. This is Kephas. Until next time.